Hello and good morning. My name is Dean Bonner, and I'm an Associate Survey Director and a Research Fellow at the Public Policy Institute of California. Welcome to our virtual program today, featuring our latest PPIC statewide survey on Californians and their government. Today's event is supported with funding from the PPIC Corporate Circle and the PPIC Donor Circle. The survey was supported with funding from the R.J. and Francis F. Miller Foundation and the James Irvine Foundation. We thank them for their generous support. For today's program, my colleague, Rachel Lawler, will walk you through some of the key findings from the survey, and then we will discuss some of our main takeaways and answer questions from the audience. However, before I introduce my colleague, I have a couple of housekeeping items. As a public charity, PPIC does not take or support positions on any ballot measure or legislation, nor does it support, endorse, or oppose any political parties or candidates for public office. And today, if you have a question about the survey, please send an email to the address on the screen, ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. If you could please include your name and organization along with your question, that would be great. And now I would like to welcome my colleague and survey analyst, Rachel Lawler. Hi, Rachel.
Hi, Dean, and thanks so much for that introduction, and to all of you watching for joining us for this briefing and for your interest in PPIC's work. Just give me a moment to share my screen, make sure you can all see the presentation. Okay. So before we begin, I would just like to acknowledge my co-authors of this report, which include Dean, who you just heard from, as well as PPIC President and CEO, Mark Baldessari, and survey analyst, Deja Thomas. As Dean mentioned, this survey is part of our Californians and their government series, which has covered numerous state and national issues since 1999. And for those of you who might be joining us for the first time and are unfamiliar with the statewide survey, its mission is to provide timely, relevant, nonpartisan data on political, social, and economic opinions, which we hope will then be used to help inform and improve state policymaking, raise awareness, and encourage discussion. The PPIC survey covers public perceptions, attitudes, and policy preferences, as well as ballot choices on both state and national races. And since the start of the survey, PPIC has provided a voice for roughly 400,000 Californians on nearly 200 general, issue-specific, and regional surveys. This particular survey was conducted from September 2nd through the 11th, using telephone interviews, and 75% of those interviews were conducted on cell phones and 25% were done on landlines. The interviews were conducted in either English or Spanish, according to the respondent's preference. Our sample includes just over 1,700 California adults, and of that total sample, we have identified 1,060 of those respondents as likely voters. The margin of error is 3.9% for all adults and 5.4% for likely voters. So I have structured this presentation today with the upcoming midterm election in mind. And I want to start out by setting the stage in terms of what's important to Californians and how they are feeling as we near Election Day. So to start off, we asked respondents to name the most important issue facing the state, and we did not provide them a list. So all the answers were spontaneously volunteered by the respondents. Although this survey was conducted prior to the release of the latest Consumer Price Index report, which was released a couple days ago, we find that about 3 in 10 adults name either jobs, the economy, or inflation. So when we take that together as a bucket of economic issues and put it under one banner, it's the top issue mentioned this time around. And it was also the #1 issue when we asked this question in our May survey a few months ago. Today, it's also the most important issue among likely voters, as well as among partisan groups and across regions, as well as all demographic groups. So concern about the economy and related issues is definitely widespread. And this is likely something that will almost certainly have an impact at the ballot box this November. Other issues that were mentioned by more than 5% of adults include homelessness, housing costs and availability, water and the current drought, and the environment and climate change. So these are some other fairly substantial issues, but they really do pale in comparison with jobs, the economy, and inflation at this time. And in that same economic vein, we asked a question that we have been asking in our surveys for the past few months, and that is whether recent price increases have caused any financial hardship in the respondents' household. And an overwhelming majority of 71% of adults say that the price increases have caused them hardship, and 38% say that has been a serious financial hardship. And that's actually the highest share, both overall saying that they have experienced a hardship, as well as among those who are saying a serious hardship that we've measured in the 3 surveys in which we have asked this question. And when we break this data down into subgroups, we do find that Republicans are more than twice as likely as Democrats and independents to say that they've experienced a serious hardship. And regionally, the shares of residents claiming they have had a serious hardship is highest in the Central Valley and lowest in the San Francisco Bay Area. We also find that African Americans and Latinos are more likely to report a serious hardship than are Asian Americans or whites. And the percentage of Californians experiencing serious hardships due to the increasing prices declines sharply as income levels and educational attainment increase. So next, we're going to look at 2 specific issues, one of which was the second most important issue, as I'm sure some of you remember, that was named in the previous question on the most important issue facing the state. And those 2 issues are homelessness and violence and street crime. I'm sure many of you are very aware that both of these topics have been in the news quite frequently over the past couple of years, and certainly they are substantial enough issues that they may have serious impacts on how voters choose to cast their ballot. So we asked 2 questions, the first being, how big of a problem is homelessness in your part of California? And the second, how much of a problem are violence and street crime in your local community today? So if we look at homelessness first, a solid majority of 68% of Californians said that it is a big problem in their part of the state, and 70% of likely voters also say this, which is in line with what we have found in past surveys. This is an area where we see partisan agreement, with 66% of Republicans, 68% of independents, and 76% of Democrats saying it's a big problem. And across regions, the share saying it's a big problem is highest in LA at 76% and lowest in Orange and San Diego counties at 50%. And among all of the demographic subgroups, majorities of about 6 in 10 or more say that it is a big problem. So this is not something we find all that often in our surveys, but there is really a broad consensus in terms of the severity of the homelessness issue among Californians. And turning to violence and street crime, 64% say it's at least somewhat of a problem in their community, but only 31% of adults and 28% of likely voters say it is a big problem. So while it is certainly far from being a non-issue, the seriousness of it is nowhere near that of homelessness. And among partisan groups, Republicans are much more likely to say it's a big problem than are independents or Democrats. We also find that roughly 1/3 across regions hold this view, with the one exception of residents in Orange and San Diego, where just 16% say it's a big problem. There are also some notable differences I wanted to mention among demographic groups. We see that women are more likely than men to say it's a big problem, and African Americans and Latinos are also more likely to say it's a big problem than are Asian Americans or whites. And finally, the sheriffs who feel that violence and street crime are a big problem in their local community decline as income and education levels increase. Next, we're going to take a look at perceptions about the direction of the state. And currently, Californians have slightly more optimistic than pessimistic views, with half saying it is going in the right direction and 44% saying direction. We do, however, find that likely voters are a little bit more divided on this topic. And when we asked this question in May, findings were almost the exact inverse of this, with 45% of adults saying right direction and 50% saying the opposite. So sentiment has improved just slightly since then. Today, we do find partisans are deeply divided, with 72% of Democrats believing the state is headed in the right direction, while 89% of Republicans and 53% of independents say wrong direction. And regionally, optimism is highest in the Bay Area and lowest in the Inland Empire. And among the many demographic groups that we capture in our surveys, majorities of African Americans, Asian Americans, and Latinos are optimistic, while a slim majority of 53% of whites are pessimistic. And finally, younger Californians ages 18 to 44 are, 18 to 44 are much more likely to say right direction than are adults age 45 and older, while those with a college degree are more likely to be optimistic than those who have less formal education. So before we move on to some specific findings related to the midterm elections, I wanted to quickly take you through the approval ratings of some of our state elected officials. Governor Newsom currently has the approval of 52% of adults and 55% of likely voters, and his approval has remained at 50% or above since before the start of the pandemic. Majorities of Democrats and independents approve of the governor, while most Republicans disapprove, and about half or more across most of the demographic groups approve, with the exception of adults with some college education as well as whites. Across regions, majorities approve only in the San Francisco Bay Area and Los Angeles compared to other regions. And in terms of the state legislature and respondents' own state representatives, we find just under half of adults and likely voters approving of each. And like we saw with the governor, there is a wide partisan divide, with most Democrats approving of the legislature and their own representative, while most Republicans disapprove and independents are fairly divided. For the legislature, approval is highest in the Bay Area and lowest in the Inland Empire, as well as in Orange and San Diego counties, while for their own representative, approval is also highest, again, in the Bay Area and lowest in the Central Valley. And finally, among racial ethnic groups, we find that whites are less likely to approve of both the legislature and their own state representative than are Americans, Asian Americans, or Latinos. So now that we have a bit of context in terms of the environment leading up to the election in California, we're going to move on to some of the state races that will be on the ballot this fall, starting with the governor's race. And if the election were held today, Governor Newsom would be reelected, as 58% of likely voters say they would vote for him, versus 31% who would vote for Republican challenger Brian Daly. And 7% say they haven't made up their mind, and then another small 5% say that they wouldn't vote in the governor's race. Unsurprisingly, partisans heavily favor their own party's candidate, and independents favor Newsom, with 55% of them saying they will cast a vote for Newsom, while 35% support Daly. Regionally, Newsom has support, or a majority support, among likely the San Francisco area and LA, as well as half in the Central Valley, while those in Orange and San Diego, as well as the Inland Empire, are divided. Newsom is favored across all age, gender, home ownership, income, and racial ethnic groups. And he reaches a majority of the vote among all of these groups, with the exception of likely voters with only a high school diploma, as well as those earning earning between 40 and 80,000 annually. So in sum, if the election were today, Governor Newsom would almost certainly win re-election by a wide margin. Next, we're going to turn to the vote on some of the state propositions that will be on the ballot. Due to the time constraints on our survey, we only included 3 of the higher profile ballot measures, and those are propositions 1, 27, and 30. And for each of these, the respondents were read the proposition number, the ballot title, and the ballot label. So starting first with Proposition 1, the constitutional right to reproductive freedom. This was placed on the ballot by the state legislature, and if it were passed, it would amend the California Constitution to include the fundamental right to choose to have an abortion and the fundamental right to choose or refuse contraceptives. And if the election were today, 69% of likely voters would vote yes on Prop 1, a quarter would vote no, and just 6% are unsure how they would vote. We also asked about Proposition 27, called Allows Online and Mobile Sports Wagering Outside Tribal Lands. This citizens initiative would allow Indian tribes and affiliated businesses to operate online and mobile sports wagering outside tribal lands. And today, 34% of likely voters say they would vote yes. A slim majority of 54% would vote no, and 12% are unsure how they would vote. And finally, we also asked about Proposition 30, which is titled Provides Funding for Programs to Reduce Air Pollution and Prevent Wildfires by Increasing Tax on Personal Income over $2 million. That's a bit of a mouthful, but this citizens initiative would increase taxes on Californians earning more than $2 million annually, and it would allocate that tax revenue to zero emission vehicle purchase incentives, charging stations, electric vehicles, as well as wildfire prevention. And currently, 55% of likely voters say that they would vote yes, 4 in 10 would vote no, and 5% are unsure. So now we're going to take just a little bit of a deeper dive into how some subgroups say they will vote on these 3 propositions. Starting again with Prop 1, we find that strong majorities of more than 2 in 3 Democrats and independents say they would vote yes, while 61% of Republicans would vote no. We also find that majorities across the state's regions, as well as demographic groups, say they would vote yes on the measure. So there is currently broad and fairly strong support for Proposition 1. When it comes to Prop 27, among partisans, a strong majority of Republicans would vote no, compared to half of Democrats and independents. And across regions, majorities in the Inland Empire, Orange and San Diego, and the Bay Area would vote no, while those in the Central Valley and LA are divided. And in terms of demographic groups, those ages or voters ages 18 to 44 and renters are the only 2 groups where with a majority yes on Prop 27, and that is a slim majority. And lastly, partisans are at odds on Prop 30, with most Democrats and independents saying they would vote yes, while an overwhelming majority of Republicans say that they would vote no. And again, if we look at the data regionally, we find majorities of likely voters in the Central Valley, Los Angeles, and the San Francisco Bay Area saying that they would vote yes, while most in the Inland Empire would vote no, and those in Orange, San Diego are divided. On Prop 30, half or more across age, education, gender, home ownership, and income groups say they would vote yes. So this is another proposition where we're seeing broad support, although that support is not quite as intense as it is for Prop 1. So now that we have looked at the state, we're going to pivot to some findings about the country as a whole. And first up, we find that a majority of Californians, so 59% of adults and 63% of likely voters, say things in the United States are going in the wrong direction. And half or more have said that the country's going in the wrong direction since this time last year. And if we parse the data by partisan affiliation, we find that 93% of Republicans and 2 in 3 independents say wrong direction, while Democrats are divided. 47% say right direction and an equal 47% say wrong direction. However, there is a more general consensus across regions and across demographic groups, and majorities are pessimistic about the direction of the United States. The 2 exceptions to this are San Francisco Bay Area residents and Asian Americans. These 2 groups are a little bit more divided on this question, with half of them saying wrong direction and roughly 4 in 10 saying the opposite. So in general, right now, Californians are feeling more optimistic about the direction of their home state than they are about the US overall. And since we went over approval ratings for state elected officials, I wanted to do the same for our federal elected officials. And starting with President Biden, 53% of adults and likely voters approve of the job he is doing as president, while 42% of adults and 46% of likely voters disapprove. And his approval in California has hovered right around 50% since February. And today, and perhaps unsurprisingly, most Democrats approve, while most Republicans disapprove and independents are divided. We also find that about half or more across most of the demographic groups that we look at approve of the president, with the exception of whites and adults making between $40,000 and $80,000 a year. Among those 2 groups, a slim majority disapprove of Biden. We also find that a majority of residents in the Bay Area and Los Angeles approve of the president, while those elsewhere in the state are divided. And if we take a look at a national poll, residents' approval is higher in California than it is at the nationwide level. According to a Gallup poll that was conducted in August, 44% approve of Biden and 53% disapprove. And turning our focus now to Congress, we find approval remains low, with 39% of adults and 34% of likely voters approving of the job that Congress is doing. And approval was in line with these numbers a year ago as well. Currently, Latinos are the only subgroup where a slim majority of 52% approve. And nationally, just 17% of adults approve of Congress, according to a Gallup poll also conducted in August. So although approval is low, Californians are about twice as likely to approve of Congress as are adults nationwide. And finally, 54% of adults and 56% of likely voters approve of the way their US House representative is handling his or her job, with partisans once again deeply divided. About half or more across demographic groups approve, with the exception of 44% of adults with incomes of $40,000 to $80,000. And about half or more across regions also approve of their representative, except for the Central Valley, where 42% approve. In the November 8th midterm election is set to be highly consequential in terms of both local and state races, but also in terms of which party is going to control Congress. So we asked likely voters whether voting this year is more important to them than in past midterm elections, less important, or about the same. And a slim majority of 54% said it is about as important to them as in previous midterms, while 43% said it is more important. Hardly anyone, just 3%, said it is less important to them. Interestingly, likely voters are as likely to say that voting in this midterm is, likely voters, they're as likely to say that voting in this election is more important, like they were in March, but they are less likely to feel this way than they were before the 2018 midterms in September of that year. At that time, 52% said it was more important. So looking at the data among partisans, a slim majority of Republicans say it is more important, compared to 45% of Democrats and 37% of independents who say the same. And if we break the data down by congressional districts, we find that 54%, likely voters in Republican-held districts are much more likely than those in Democratic-held districts, and competitive districts, roughly 4 in 10 there say that voting is more important. And as a little side note, we determine which House districts in California are competitive, meaning there's a chance that either candidate who is running could win, based on the Cook Political Report's House race ratings. And as of the fieldwork period for this survey, there were 10 California districts, I think it is still 10 as of today, that have been deemed as being competitive. But anyway, back to our survey findings. And if we look at this regionally, majorities in the Inland Empire say it is more important, while most elsewhere say it is as important to prior elections. And among demographic groups, more say that voting is as important rather than more important than previous years, with the exception of 51% of voters with a high school diploma only who believe it's more important. And we're going to wrap up here by taking a look at preferences for candidates for the U.S. House of Representatives. When asked how they would vote if the 2022 election for the House were held today, 60% of likely voters said they would vote for or lean toward the Democratic candidate, while 34% would vote for or lean toward the Republican candidate. And just 7% said that they are undecided. An overwhelming majority of partisans support their own party's candidate, while independents are more likely to prefer the Democratic candidate, 58% to 33%. And Democratic candidates are preferred by a 35-point margin in Democratic-held congressional districts, while Republican candidates are preferred by an 8-point margin in Republican-held districts. And again, in those 10 competitive California districts, the Democratic candidate is preferred by a 16-point margin. 51% prefer the Democrat versus 35% who prefer the, the Republican. And the Democratic House candidate is preferred across all demographic groups, with the one exception of likely voters with a high school education only. They're divided in terms of who they would vote for. Now, in addition to the findings that I shared in this briefing, I wanted to highlight some other areas that are covered by our survey, but that we did not cover in the webinar. And those are confidence in California's election system, views on the fairness and accuracy of the 2020 election result, opinions on the economic outlook of the US, satisfaction with the gubernatorial candidates, the perceived importance of the vote outcomes on Props 1, 27, and 30, as well as perceptions of the amount of homelessness and crime in local communities. So I highly encourage everyone to go check out the full report to find out more, not only on the topics I covered, but on these ones as well. And that report is available on the PPIC website. So at this point, that concludes the presentation slides, but I would like to remind everyone in the audience to submit any questions you might have or comments to the email listed on your screen. That's ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. And please remember to include your name and your organization you are with. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it back over to Dean.
Hi. Wow, Rachel, that was a lot of great information and really well presented to our folks watching today. I would also encourage everyone, in addition to looking at the report, we do have crosstab data among adults and likely voters, as well as time trend data. So if you're curious about, how Governor Newsom has been doing over time, or Congress or whatnot, all of the information is up there. And now for some takeaways. But I guess before I start takeaways, I did want to discuss a little bit and maybe pull back the curtain in regards to why we ended up choosing the 3 initiative or ballot propositions that we decided to ask about in this survey. As you might know, there are currently 7 initiatives slated for the November ballot. In our current methodology, doing a phone survey, that is that's way too many for us to ask about in the allotted time that we have. So we're always having to make difficult choices. These choices are oftentimes, driven by things that we think are policy relevant, things that are garnering a lot of attention. And in this case, we ended up settling on Prop 1, of course, which is a kind of a very visible topic currently. It's being discussed across the nation. So we thought it would be great to get a read on that proposition, which protects reproductive rights. We also thought that Prop 30, given kind of the climate change impact and the amount of time that we have focused on climate change in our July survey, as well as just kind of a hugely important issue for the state, as well as the governor's kind of role in this, we thought it'd be a good idea to ask that one, which really kind of brought us down to asking one more, given time constraints. And we decided to end up going with Proposition 27 for a number of different reasons. It was a difficult choice. But first and foremost, Prop 27 has been extremely visible. There's been a lot of money spent on it. And it is something that we thought it would be good to get a read on. It's also the case that Prop 26 is in some ways a response to Prop 27. And so we thought that if we're going to ask one of them, Prop 27 kind of made sense. And lastly, I would just say that given the kind of connection to a problem that many Californians see, which is homelessness, where some of the funding from that would go to homelessness, that's kind of why we decided to choose the three that we did. We'll be looking at this again in advance of our October survey, and so make sure to stay tuned for that. Now for a couple of the takeaways that I found interesting. If we look at the context of the gubernatorial election and the midterm election more generally, it's notable that the context today is extremely similar to what it was in September 2021 when the governor beat back a recall attempt. If we look at Governor Newsom's approval among likely voters, it's 55% today. It was 53% in last September. The direction of the state, just under half said the state was headed in the right direction today. Last September, that was 45%. Legislative approval is extremely similar across these time periods. And of course, our findings. In that September survey, we found that 58% were going to vote no on the recall, or said they were going to vote no on the recall. The no side ended up with 61.9% of the vote. Today, we find 58% supporting Newsom. So it's a really consistent finding. It's also notable, and for a little factoid, in that the 2018 election, Governor Newsom received 61.9% of the vote, which was the same as the no side on the recall. So there's just a lot of consistency during this time period. And I think it's important to think about how folks are feeling about the governor, especially given this week he's come out and seemingly is going to play a prominent role on the No on 30 campaign. In this survey, we find that about 3 in 4 Democratic and independent likely voters who approve of Governor Newsom also support Proposition 30. So this is a group that potentially could be impacted by the governor being a vocal opponent of Proposition 30. So this is something I'll be looking forward to looking at in our October survey. And lastly, before we open it up for questions, I just want to talk about a topic that has been discussed a lot nationally, and it is kind of the relationship between Latinos and the Democratic Party. There's been a lot of discussion about the erosion of Democratic support among Latinos. However, when we look at the survey today, we find that 3 in 4 Latino likely voters say they would vote or lean toward the Democratic candidate on the generic ballot. It's important to note that that's an 18-point jump from March and a 14-point jump from May. And so if there were some erosion, that is seemingly in California, we're seeing that kind of increase in recent months. And it's notable that the 74% supporting the Democratic candidate today is actually 10 points higher than in September 2020, the last election. And while the election is still 2 months away, at this point, it seems as though most Latinos are still standing with the Democratic Party. But as with all polling, today's survey is merely just a snapshot in time. And this will be one of the things I'll be looking at closely in October as we kind of move towards the midterm election. And I think with that, I do want to open it up to questions. So once again, if you do have a question, please send it to ppiceventquestion@gmail.com. And if you could provide your information regarding your organization as well as your name, that would be great. So at this point, Rachel, did you have anything to add from my takeaways?
No, I thought those were really insightful and great takeaways, very topical. And I too am interested to see, especially what you were talking about with Prop 30, how that might change the vote between partisan groups in the next month. I think it's going to be something really interesting to look at, especially because while a majority are voting yes now, at least if the election were today, 55%, that's I guess you could call that a slim majority or an almost slim majority. So with such a heavy Democratic base and the governor taking a prominent role, I could see that changing potentially. So it'll be something to watch for sure.
Sure enough. And it looks like we have a question. It says, your survey points to the overall partisan leanings when it comes to the House races this fall. What do your findings show about differences across regions of the state? You want to take this one, Rachel?
Sure. So there definitely are some differences between regions in terms of candidate preference for House candidates. The Democratic candidate, the generic Democratic candidate that we asked about, is preferred by strong majorities in Los Angeles and in the San Francisco Bay Area. In LA, 68% said that they would vote for or lean toward the Democrat if the election were today, as would 71% in the Bay Area. Conversely, 56% of likely voters in the Inland Empire would vote for the Republican candidate. And it's a much closer race in the Central Valley, where a slim majority, so 53%, prefer the Democrat and 43% prefer the Republican. And also it's a similar story in Orange and San Diego counties, where half favor the Democrat and 43% the Republican. So excuse me, the Democratic candidate definitely is in the lead in most of the kind of general regions that we capture. But I think it's also important to remember that the congressional elections are conducted by individual districts. So in terms of the final outcome of the partisan makeup of the California delegation could look different from these regional numbers.
Yeah, for sure. And as always, the regional findings are kind of colored by the partisan makeup of those areas. So yeah, we have another question. This is, what do you think, or sorry, what do you make of the fact that Californians appear to have a brighter outlook for our state than for the nation? You know, this is a really interesting question. And I think that, you know, overall, this has been a pretty consistent trend in 2022 thus far. We've seen double-digit differences between the right direction of the state and the right direction of the nation. But interestingly, in 2021, there was really only like a 1 to 3 point differences between that, you know, and this is kind of notable because the approval ratings of Newsom and Biden have kind of been stable across this time, which is oftentimes kind of, we see a linkage between the direction and approval of the leader. But I do think that while the the California direction, well, that's not great, it's perhaps buoyed by just the fact that the state budget situation is great or better than it has been in previous years. While at the federal level, there's probably more blame when it comes to things like inflation and gas prices. And so I think that could be leading to some of that kind of difference of the way people are thinking about the two. And so, yeah. And of course, Congress is always has recently received lower ratings. And so that's potentially as well an impact. Yeah. So it looks like we have another question. Have your surveys over time pointed to any longer term trends with regard to concerns over crime?
Yeah, I can go ahead and take this one. So in terms of the question we asked in this survey that I talked about earlier in regards to the problem seriousness of violence and street crime in local communities, we have seen a bit of a change over the past couple of years. We first asked that question all the way back in February 2011. And from then all the way through to February 2020, the shares saying that violence and street crime are a big problem was right around, consistently right around a quarter on average. And then in February 2020, 24% said that it was a big problem. 2 years later, so February 2022, that jumped up 10 points to 34%. And then it's roughly the same today at 31%. So there's definitely been an increase in the share of Californians who say that violence and street crime are a big problem. I also wanted to mention, although we didn't ask the question in this particular survey, I went back just out of curiosity myself and looked at some previous surveys, and there's been kind of a complementary, if you want to phrase it like that, drop and a gradual drop in the share of Californians who say that local police are doing an excellent job controlling crime in their community. In March 2017, 30% said that they were doing an excellent job. And then we last asked that question in our February survey this year, and just 18% felt that way. So there certainly seems to be some trends in terms of the extent of the crime problem, people feeling like that's going up, while at the same time feeling that the law enforcement effectiveness is going down. Yeah.
And I would point you to a blog I believe I did in May, which kind of points at the increase in the share saying big problem is pretty widespread. It's across most groups. There has been this increase. So
yeah, that's a great point.
Put in one last question. This is a good one. What sort of effect do you expect President Biden's standing in California to have on midterms? Are there issues that are especially key as to the president's approval in California? Don't have much time, but I will say that the impact of President Biden will likely be greater in California compared to other states, given how blue the state is. But I do think that the state of the economy, inflation, gas expenses will definitely play a role in kind of how active he will be even in a state like California. I will say that after seeing his approval dip earlier in the year, a slim majority of likely voters, including half of independents, approve of his performance this month. And so, when you're looking at the national kind of picture in these congressional districts, I think kind of how independents are feeling about the president could play a role in kind of how they're feeling about Democratic candidates down the ballot. And so I think that is really an important kind of connection. And so we've seen independent numbers kind of increase a little bit. And so that may play a factor in how they're feeling about the Democratic Party more generally. And with that, I just want to say thank you very much, Rachel, for all the great work today and throughout the survey process. It's often a hectic time, but I do want to say thanks for all the great work that you've done.
Thanks, Dean.
And at this point, we've reached the end of our program. I would also, beyond thanking Rachel, I would also like to thank our funders. And finally, thanks to all of you for joining us today online. If you pre-registered for the event today, you will receive a survey. Survey folks, we like giving surveys. We would appreciate you taking a couple of minutes to respond and just let us know how we did. And with that, thanks for joining us, and please be safe and have a great afternoon. Thank you.